I still remember the sound of his laughter echoing through the small wooden hallway of our house in Ohio. It was a soft, warm sound, like wind chimes brushing against a quiet summer breeze. That laughter was the only thing that made the silence of my widowhood bearable. Before him, the house had felt like a hollow shell, each room holding memories that pressed against my chest like a weight I could never set down. But when he came into my life, everything changed. My grandson, Ethan. He wasn't just a child to me. He was the reason I woke up every morning, the reason I cooked meals again instead of letting canned soup sit untouched on the shelf, the reason I spoke out loud in a house that had once swallowed my voice. After my husband passed away, I had forgotten what it felt like to belong to the world. People would visit, offer condolences, and slowly drift away, returning to their busy lives. But grief does not drift. It settles. It lingers. It becomes a part of the walls. And then Ethan was born. I remember the first time I held him. He was so small, wrapped in a pale blue blanket, his face scrunched as if the world had already disappointed him. But when I touched his tiny fingers, he stopped crying, just like that. His whole body softened and his breathing steadied. The nurse smiled and said, "Looks like he knows you already." I believed that. I still do. From that moment, I felt like God had given me a second chance, not to replace what I had lost, but to remind me that love could exist again, even after everything had been taken. My son, Daniel, stood beside me in that hospital room, tired but proud. He had always been a good boy growing up, quiet, respectful, and deeply attached to his father. When his father died, I saw something in him break, though he never spoke of it. He just buried himself in work, in responsibilities, in anything that kept him from feeling too much. When he introduced me to Claire, his wife, I welcomed her with open arms. She was beautiful in a sharp, polished way, always dressed neatly, always speaking carefully, as if every word had been measured before leaving her lips. I tried to see her not as someone new, but as someone who would expand our family. And for a while, things felt right. After Ethan was born, I began spending more time at their house. At first, it was just to help. Claire seemed overwhelmed and Daniel was often at work. I would cook meals, clean the kitchen, and hold Ethan so she could rest. She thanked me in the beginning. I remember that clearly. There were moments when she would smile, real smiles, not the thin, polite ones, and I thought perhaps we would grow close. But something shifted over time. It started with small things. A look, a pause before speaking, a subtle tightening of her jaw when Ethan reached for me instead of her. I told myself I was imagining it. After all, motherhood is hard, exhausting, emotional. I didn't want to believe there was anything more behind it. Ethan grew quickly, too quickly, as all children do. Within months, he began recognizing faces, responding to voices, and smiling in that pure, unguarded way that only Bobbies can. And every time he saw me, his eyes would light up. "Ma, ma," he would babble, reaching out his tiny arms. Claire would laugh awkwardly. "He doesn't even know what he's saying yet." But I saw the flicker in her eyes. I tried to step back. I really did. I told myself to give them space, to let them build their own rhythm as a family. But Daniel would call me. "Mom, can you come over? Claire's not feeling well." "Mom, I've got a late shift. Can you stay with Ethan?" And how could I say no? Every moment with Ethan felt like a gift I wasn't willing to refuse. So I kept going. I became a constant presence in that house. I knew where everything was, knew how Ethan liked his milk warmed, how he needed to be rocked a certain way before he fell asleep. I memorized the soft hum that calmed him, the gentle rhythm that brought him peace. When he cried in the middle of the night, it was often my arms that soothed him. And that, I think, is when Claire began to see me not as help, but as something else. One evening, I arrived at their house earlier than usual. Daniel had asked me to come by because he had an urgent meeting, and Claire had a doctor's appointment. I let myself in with the spare key they had given me. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I walked into the living room and found Ethan in his crib, crying softly. His cheeks were flushed, his tiny hands trembling as he reached out to no one. My heart clenched. "Oh, my baby," I whispered, lifting him gently into my arms. He clung to me instantly, burying his face against my shoulder as if he had been waiting for me. I rocked him slowly, humming the same tune I had sung countless times before. It didn't take long for him to calm down. But when Claire walked in and saw us, something in her expression hardened in a way I had never seen before. "I was only gone for 20 minutes, she said, her voice tight. "I just got here," I replied softly. "He was crying." "He cries," she snapped. "That's what Bobbies do." I blinked, taken aback by her tone. "I know, I just thought." "You always think," she interrupted. "You always step in like you know better." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. "I'm just trying to help," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't ask for this much help," she said, crossing her arms. "Sometimes it feels like you're trying to take over." My chest tightened. "That's not true." "Isn't it?" she replied. "He reaches for you more than he does for me." I looked down at Ethan, who was now peacefully resting against me, his breathing slow and steady. "He's just comfortable with me," I said gently. "And what does that say about me?" she shot back. I had no answer. That was the first real crack. After that day, things were never the same. Claire began setting boundaries, small at first, then larger. She asked me to call before coming over, even though I had always done so. She insisted on handling Ethan's routines herself, even when she was clearly exhausted. She corrected me in front of Daniel, pointing out things I had done wrong, even if they had never been an issue before. Daniel tried to smooth things over. "Mom, she's just stressed," he would say. "Try to understand." And I did, or at least I tried. But understanding does not make rejection hurt any less. Still, I held on to hope. I believed that time would soften things, that Claire would see I meant no harm, that we could find a balance. Because at the center of it all was Ethan. My sweet, beautiful Ethan. He continued to grow, his personality blooming like a flower in spring. He loved toy cars, even before he could properly hold them. He would laugh uncontrollably when I made silly faces, his tiny body shaking with joy. And at night, when I tucked him in, he would grab my finger and refuse to let go until he drifted off to sleep. "Stay," he would whisper, his voice barely formed. And I always did. I didn't know then that those moments were numbered. I didn't know that every laugh, every hug, every whispered "stay" was leading me closer to a day when I would be forced to let go, not by choice, but by something far more cruel. If I had known, I would have held him longer. I would have memorized every detail, the warmth of his skin, the softness of his hair, the way his eyes looked at me as if I was his whole world. Because one day, without warning, without mercy, he would be taken away from me forever. And the silence that followed would be far worse than the one I had known before he was born. The change did not come like a storm. There were no raised voices at first, no dramatic confrontations that would have warned me of what was coming. Instead, it crept in quietly, like winter settling over a once warm home, slow, cold, and impossible to ignore once it had fully arrived. After that evening, Claire became distant in a way that words cannot fully describe. It wasn't just that she spoke less to me. It was the way she looked at me, as if I had crossed an invisible line that only she could see. I began to notice how she would take Ethan from my arms more quickly than before. If he reached for me, she would gently, but firmly, redirect him. "Come to Mommy," she would say, her voice sweet, but her eyes watching me carefully. At first, I told myself it was natural. Of course she wanted to be close to her son. Of course she wanted to feel needed. But there was something underneath it, something tense and unspoken that made every interaction feel like I was walking on fragile glass. Daniel, as always, remained caught in the middle. "Mom, just give it time," he told me one evening over the phone. "She's adjusting. Being a new mother isn't easy." "I know that," I replied softly. "I've been there." He sighed, tired. "Then you understand why she needs space." Space. It was a simple word, but it felt like a door slowly closing. So I stepped back. I stopped coming over unless I was asked. I called before every visit, even when Daniel told me it wasn't necessary. I kept my opinions to myself, even when I saw Claire struggling in ways I knew I could help with. But no matter how careful I was, the distance only grew. Weeks passed and my time with Ethan became less frequent. The house that once felt like a second home began to feel unfamiliar, almost chez ou jet to me. When I did visit, things felt staged, controlled. Claire would hover nearby, watching every interaction. If he's crying, give him to me. He shouldn't be eating that yet. He needs to nap now. Every sentence was polite, but there was a firmness behind it that left no room for argument. I nodded. I complied. I swallowed the ache that built in my chest each time I handed Ethan back sooner than I wanted to. But Ethan, he didn't understand any of this. He would still reach for me the moment I walked in, his face lighting up in a way that made my heart both soar and break at the same time. "Grandma," he would say now, his words clearer, his voice full of joy. And every time, Claire's smile would tighten just a little more. One afternoon, Daniel called me unexpectedly. "Mom, can you come over today?" he asked, Claire not feeling well again. I hesitated. "Is she okay with that?" I asked carefully. There was a pause. "Yeah," he said, though something in his tone sounded uncertain. "It'll help." So I went. When I arrived, Claire was sitting on the couch, a blanket draped over her shoulders. She looked pale, tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. "I didn't know you were coming," she said when she saw me. "Daniel asked me to," I replied gently. "I can leave if—" "No," she cut in quickly. "You're here now." Her words were neutral, but her expression was unreadable. Ethan was playing on the floor, surrounded by his toys. The moment he saw me, he squealed with excitement and crawled toward me as fast as he could. I knelt down, opening my arms. "There's my boy," I whispered, lifting him up and holding him close. For a brief moment, everything felt normal again. His small arms wrapped around my neck, his laughter filling the room. It was like breathing after being underwater for too long. Claire watched us in silence. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. I helped around the house, prepared a simple meal, and kept Ethan entertained while Claire rested. She didn't say much, but she didn't stop me either. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to feel a small sense of hope. Maybe things were getting better. Maybe this distance was only temporary. But hope can be a dangerous thing when it blinds you to what is already unfolding. That evening, after Daniel returned home, we sat down for dinner together. It had been a long time since we had all shared a meal like that. Ethan sat in his high chair, happily banging his spoon against the tray. Daniel smiled, reaching over to steady it. "Easy there, buddy," he laughed. I watched them, my heart softening at the sight. This was what family looked like. This was what I had been holding on to. But then Claire spoke. "I think we need to talk about something," she said, her voice calm but firm. The air shifted instantly. Daniel looked at her, confused. "About what?" She glanced at me briefly before continuing. "About boundaries." My hand stilled. Daniel frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said, choosing her words carefully, "that we need to establish clearer limits when it comes to outside involvement." Outside involvement. The words landed heavily, though she hadn't said my name. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Claire." "I'm serious," she interrupted. "This isn't working." I felt my chest tighten. "If this is about me." "It is," she said, meeting my eyes directly for the first time that evening. Silence filled the room. "I appreciate everything you've done," she continued, her tone measured. "But Ethan is my son, and lately it feels like I'm being pushed aside in my own home." "That's not true," I said quickly, my voice trembling. "I would never." "You may not realize it," she said, "but it's happening." Daniel rubbed his forehead, clearly stressed. "Claire, Mom's just helping." "She's doing more than helping," Claire replied. "She's taking over." "I'm not," I whispered. Ethan, sensing the tension, began to fuss. His small voice broke the silence, but no one moved immediately. I think it would be best, Claire went on, if we limited visits for a while. The words felt like a sudden drop beneath my feet. Limited, I repeated. Yes, she said, just until things feel more balanced. Daniel looked at me, guilt written all over his face. Mom, it's just temporary. Temporary. I forced a small nod, though my heart was already sinking. Of course, I said quietly, if that's what you both think is best. Claire gave a small, relieved nod. But in that moment, I realized something I had been trying to ignore. This wasn't just about space. This was about distance. And distance, once created, has a way of growing far beyond what anyone intends. That night, as I drove home alone, the house felt colder than it had in years. The silence returned, not the familiar kind I had once lived with, but a heavier, more suffocating one. I sat in the living room, staring at the empty chair where Ethan used to sit during his visits. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself things would go back to normal. I told myself I just had to be patient. But deep down, there was a quiet, growing fear I couldn't ignore. Something had changed. And this time, I wasn't sure it would ever change back. The days that followed felt longer than they should have. Time, once filled with the soft rhythm of Ethan's laughter and the small, meaningful routines we shared, now stretched endlessly before me. Mornings became the hardest. I would wake up out of habit, expecting to hear his little voice in the next room, expecting to prepare his breakfast, to warm his milk just the way he liked it. But there was nothing. Just silence. At first, I respected their decision completely. I told myself that love sometimes meant stepping back, even when every part of you wanted to hold on tighter. So I waited. I didn't call as often. I didn't show up unannounced. I gave them the space they had asked for, hoping, quietly, desperately, that it would bring us closer again. But distance has a strange way of reshaping relationships. What begins as a pause can slowly become an absence. A week passed before I saw Ethan again. Daniel called me late in the afternoon. His voice sounded tired, strained in a way I had begun to recognize. Mom, do you think you could come by for a couple of hours? He asked. My heart lifted instantly, though I tried not to let it show too much. Of course, I said. Is everything all right? Yeah, he replied, hesitating. Claire just needs some rest. I didn't ask more. I didn't want to risk changing his mind. When I arrived, the house felt different. It wasn't just the silence, it was the atmosphere. The warmth that once welcomed me in seemed to have faded, replaced by something distant, almost unfamiliar. I stepped inside slowly, as if I were entering someone else's home. Ethan was in the living room, sitting on the floor with his toys. For a moment, I simply stood there watching him. He looked bigger. Children grow so quickly, but when you miss even a little time, the change feels sudden, almost shocking. His hair had grown slightly longer, his movements more confident. He was no longer the tiny baby I could hold with one arm. He was becoming his own little person. Ethan, I whispered softly. He looked up. And then, just like before, his face lit up. Grandma, he called out, his voice full of excitement as he pushed himself up and ran toward me. I dropped my purse without thinking and opened my arms. When he reached me, I held him tightly, closing my eyes as if I could somehow make the moment last longer. He smelled the same, like baby soap, and something warm and comforting that I could never quite put into words. I missed you, I murmured, my voice trembling. I missed you too, he said, though the words came out slightly uneven, still learning their shape. I pulled back just enough to look at him. You've gotten so big, I said with a soft smile. He giggled, clearly pleased. For those few moments, everything else disappeared. But reality has a way of returning quickly. Claire was standing in the doorway. I hadn't even noticed her at first. She was watching us, her expression unreadable, her arms crossed lightly over her chest. There was no anger in her face, but there was no warmth either. Just distance. Hi, I said gently, trying to keep my voice steady. Hi, she replied. That was all. Daniel appeared a moment later, offering me a small, grateful smile. Thanks for coming, Mom. Of course, I said. The evening passed quietly. I stayed with Ethan in the living room, playing with his toys, reading him the same picture books he loved, laughing at the way he insisted on turning the pages too quickly. Every second felt precious, like something I had to hold on to before it slipped away again. But I couldn't ignore the difference. Claire stayed nearby the entire time. Not interfering, not speaking much, but always there, watching, observing. If Ethan sat in my lap too long, she would call him over for something small. Ethan, come help me with this. Ethan, it's time for your snack. Ethan, Mommy needs you. Each time, he would hesitate, looking back at me before slowly going to her. And each time, I smiled, pretending it didn't hurt. Because what else could I do? Later that night, when it was time for me to leave, Ethan clung to me. No, stay, he said, wrapping his arms tightly around my neck. My heart ached. I can't tonight, sweetheart. Why? He asked, his voice small, confused. I glanced at Claire, who was standing a few steps away. Because Grandma has to go home, I said softly. I go with you, he insisted. Claire stepped forward then, gently but firmly taking him from my arms. Ethan, that's enough, she said. Grandma will come another day. He began to cry, reaching out for me. Grandma. I felt something inside me break in that moment, but I forced myself to stay calm. It's okay, I whispered, brushing his hair back. I'll see you soon. But as I walked out of the house, his cries followed me. They stayed with me all the way home. Days turned into weeks. The visits became less frequent. Sometimes Daniel would call, asking me to come by for a short time. Other times there would be silence, long stretches of it. When I did see Ethan, he was always happy, always loving, but there was a new layer of confusion in him, as if he didn't understand why I wasn't around the way I used to be. And how could he? Children don't understand adult decisions. They only feel absence. One afternoon, I decided to call instead of waiting. It had been nearly 2 weeks since I had last seen him. Claire answered. Hello, her voice came through, distant as ever. Hi, Claire, it's me, I said carefully. I was wondering if I could come by and see Ethan today. There was a pause. I don't think today is a good day, she replied. Oh, I said, trying to keep the disappointment out of my voice. Is everything okay? Yes, she said simply. We just have plans. All right, I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Maybe tomorrow. I'll let you know, she said. The call ended shortly after. She never let me know. I began to feel it more clearly then. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't just space. This was something else. Something intentional. And the hardest part was that Daniel, he wasn't stopping it. He would still call occasionally, still speak to me with the same quiet affection. But when it came to Claire, to the boundaries she was creating, he remained silent. Or worse, he agreed. Mom, just give it time, he would repeat. But time was doing the opposite of what he believed. It wasn't healing anything. It was taking something away. Piece by piece. Day by day. Until one evening, as I sat alone in my dimly lit living room, staring at the framed photo of Ethan on the table beside me, a realization settled deep into my chest. I was no longer a part of his daily life. I was becoming a visitor. And visitors can be stopped from coming at all. The realization did not arrive loudly. It came quietly, like a whisper you only notice after it has already changed the shape of your thoughts. I remember sitting in my living room that evening, the light outside fading into a dull gray, watching the small framed photo of Ethan on the table. His smile in that picture was wide, innocent, untouched by the changes unfolding around him. I found myself studying it longer than I should have, as if I could step back into that frozen moment and undo everything that had shifted since. The house felt emptier than ever. Not because it was physically empty. I had lived alone for years, but because I now knew what it felt like to lose something again after having it. That kind of loss is different. It doesn't just leave silence. It leaves memory behind, and memory can be cruel when it refuses to fade. My phone sat beside me. I kept checking it, even though I knew there would be no message. No call. No update. I told myself not to think too deeply. I told myself Claire was simply busy, that families go through phases, that I was overreacting because I missed Ethan too much. But deep down, I knew something had changed permanently. The next time I saw him came unexpectedly. Daniel arrived at my door late in the afternoon. I could tell from the moment I opened it that something was off. His shoulders were tense, his eyes tired, as if he hadn't slept properly in days. "Mom," he said softly, "can I come in?" I stepped aside immediately. "Of course, is everything all right?" He hesitated before sitting down at the edge of the couch. "Yeah, I just needed to talk to you." My heart tightened. "About Ethan?" He nodded. That was enough to make my breath catch. "What happened?" I asked quickly, trying to stay calm but failing to hide the concern in my voice. "It's not bad," he said immediately, as if trying to reassure me before I even knew the situation. "It's just, things have been a little sensitive at home." Sensitive. That word again. I sat across from him, waiting. Claire's influence had already become something I could feel even when she wasn't in the room. She didn't need to speak to me directly anymore. She spoke through pauses, through decisions, through the way visits were arranged or canceled. Daniel rubbed his hands together slowly. She thinks the visits might still be too frequent." My stomach dropped slightly, though I kept my face steady. "I don't come that often anymore." "I know," he said quickly. "I told her that." And he looked away. That silence told me everything. I felt something cold settle inside my chest. "Daniel, am I not allowed to see my grandson anymore?" He shook his head immediately. No, it's not like that." "Then what is it like?" I asked, my voice softer now but heavier. He exhaled slowly. "It's just, she feels like Ethan gets upset when you leave." I almost laughed, but it came out more like a breath. "He gets upset because he's a child who loves his grandmother." "I know," Daniel said, rubbing his forehead. "But Claire says it's affecting his routine. His sleep, his behavior. She thinks he gets too attached too quickly." Too attached. As if love was something harmful. As if a child could ever love too much. I looked at my son carefully. "And what do you think?" That question lingered between us longer than anything else. Daniel didn't answer right away. That was the answer. "I think," he finally said, choosing each word carefully, "that maybe we just need to slow things down a bit more." Slow things down. I nodded slowly, though my heart felt like it was tightening with every beat. "All right," I said quietly, "if that's what you think is best." Relief crossed his face, though it didn't reach his eyes. Because even he knew something was wrong. He just wasn't willing to say it out loud. Before he left, he paused at the door. "Mom," he said, turning back toward me, "Ethan loves you, that hasn't changed." I gave him a small smile, though it felt fragile. "I know." But love, I was beginning to understand, wasn't the problem. Access was. And access was slipping away from me. Days turned into another week. Then another. My visits stopped being scheduled and became uncertain. Every attempt to see Ethan now required approval, coordination, timing, and even then, there was always a chance it would be canceled at the last moment. One afternoon, I finally received a message from Claire directly. It was short. "We think it's best to pause visits for now. Ethan needs stability." I read it 3 times. Each time, the words felt heavier. Pause. Not stop. But pause. As if this was temporary. As if I was just being set aside, not removed. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. "Okay," I wrote, nothing more. Because what else could I say? That night, I didn't sleep. I kept replaying everything in my mind, every visit, every moment with Ethan, every smile, every time he reached for me without hesitation, without confusion. Was I really harming him? Or was I simply being removed from him because I was too loved by him? The thought made my chest ache. The next few days were the hardest. Silence became constant. No calls. No updates. No Ethan. I tried distracting myself with small tasks, cleaning, cooking, watching television, but nothing held my attention. Every sound in the house reminded me of him. Every empty space felt louder than before. Then, one morning, my phone rang. Unknown number. My hands trembled slightly as I answered. Hello. There was a pause. Then Ethan's voice. Small, unsteady, familiar. Grandma. My heart stopped. For a second, I couldn't speak. Ethan, I whispered. I miss you, he said simply. That was all. No explanation, no context, just truth, pure and unfiltered, the way children speak it without knowing the weight it carries. Tears filled my eyes instantly. I miss you too, my baby. There was a faint sound in the background, someone speaking, the phone shifting. Then the call ended. Just like that. I sat there holding the phone, long after the line went silent. Because in that brief moment, everything I had been trying to accept collapsed again. He was still there. Still my Ethan. Still reaching for me in whatever way he could. But I could feel it now more than ever. Something was building around him. Something I couldn't see clearly yet, but I could feel closing in. And I had no idea how to stop it. After that phone call, I stopped pretending I was okay. There are moments in life when denial stops protecting you and starts hurting you more than the truth ever could. That call from Ethan was one of those moments. His small voice had reopened something in me that I had been carefully trying to seal shut, the part of me that still believed I was part of his world. But the silence that followed, it confirmed what I feared. I was not. The days after felt heavier than before. Not loud, not dramatic, just heavy in a way that pressed into every hour. I would sit by the window and watch the street outside as if something might change if I stared long enough. It never did. My phone remained quiet. No messages from Daniel. No updates from Claire. No photos of Ethan. Just emptiness pretending to be routine. I began to understand something slowly, painfully. Absence does not always arrive all at once. Sometimes it is introduced in pieces small enough that you only realize their meaning when the picture is already gone. One evening, Daniel called again. I almost didn't pick up. I had started to fear his calls, not because I didn't love him, but because every conversation now felt like a negotiation I was losing. Mom, he said after a long pause, I need to talk to you. His voice already told me this wasn't going to be easy. I'm listening, I replied. He exhaled slowly. Claire thinks it might be better if we extend the break from visits. I closed my eyes. Extend. That word hit harder than it should have. How long? I asked quietly. I don't know, he admitted. That honesty hurt more than any lie would have. I spoke to her, he continued, and she feels like Ethan is confused when you come and go. It affects his mood afterward. I stood up slowly, walking toward the kitchen without realizing it. My hand rested on the counter for support. Daniel, I said gently, he's a child. He gets upset when someone he loves leaves. That doesn't mean he's confused. I know, he said quickly. I told her that. And another silence. I didn't need him to finish the sentence. Something inside me tightened. So what is this really about? He hesitated. It's about stability. That word again. Stability. As if I was a disturbance in a system that needed order. I'm his grandmother, I said softly. I know, Mom. But I feel like I'm being erased from his life. That statement hung between us. Daniel didn't respond right away. And in that silence, I heard everything he couldn't say. Finally, he spoke. That's not what we want. But it was what was happening. After the call ended, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, staring at nothing. The house felt unfamiliar again, like it had reverted back to the version of itself I lived in after my husband passed, quiet, structured, emotionally distant. But this time, it hurt differently. Because I knew what I had lost. And I knew it was still out there, just out of my reach. A few days later, something unexpected happened. A delivery arrived at my door. A small package. No sender name. I opened it carefully. Inside was a drawing. Childlike, uneven, full of color. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. A house. 3 stick figures. One taller figure, clearly me, labeled Grandma. One smaller figure labeled me. And another larger, one labeled Mommy. Underneath it, in shaky letters, Miss you. My hands trembled as I held the paper. Ethan. It had to be. I sat down slowly, pressing the drawing against my chest as tears finally broke through everything I had been holding together. He hadn't forgotten me. He hadn't moved on. He was still there, still remembering, still reaching in whatever small ways he could. But that realization brought no comfort. Only pain. Because if he was still reaching, why was I still being kept away? That night, I called Daniel again. He answered after a few rings. Mom. I got something today, I said immediately. A pause. What? A drawing from Ethan. Silence. Then a quiet sigh. Claire must have let him send it. Must have, I repeated. Yes, he said carefully. She helps him make drawings sometimes. I closed my eyes. Daniel, he wrote, miss you. I heard him shift uncomfortably. I know, he said. And you're okay with this? I asked. Another silence. Longer this time. I think, he said finally, that maybe we should wait a little longer before reopening visits. Something in me went still. Not angry. Not loud. Just still. Why? I asked quietly. Because it's complicated, he replied. Complicated. That word again. Everything was becoming complicated, except the simplest truth of all. A grandson missed his grandmother. And a grandmother was being kept away. After the call ended, I didn't cry immediately. I just sat there, holding Ethan's drawing, staring at the walls like they might explain what was happening. But walls don't explain things. They only witness them. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the drawing in my mind, the small stick figures, the misspelled words, the innocence in it. It wasn't just a drawing. It was a message. A child trying to hold onto something that was slipping away from him without his understanding. And somewhere in that silence, a realization began forming in me, slow, heavy, undeniable. This wasn't just distance anymore. This was control. And I was no longer being asked to step back. I was being removed from my grandson's life, piece by piece. Without explanation, a child could understand, or a grandmother could accept. After Ethan's drawing arrived, I kept it with me everywhere. It sat on my bedside table at night and followed me to the kitchen in the morning, as if I was afraid it might disappear if I left it alone for too long. Sometimes I would just sit and stare at it, tracing the uneven lines with my eyes, trying to convince myself that what I was feeling was real, that he still remembered me, still wanted me, still thought of me even when I wasn't there. But even comfort can turn into pain when it becomes the only thing you have. The silence from Daniel's house stretched longer than before. No calls. No visits. No updates. And every passing day felt like another step away from something I was no longer allowed to reach. I began to notice how even ordinary things started to remind me of Ethan. A toy in a store window, A child's laugh in the distance. A small pair of shoes left outside a neighbor's door. Each moment would pull me back into memories I couldn't escape, no matter how much I tried. And then, one afternoon, something changed again. My phone rang. Daniel's name flashed on the screen. My heart reacted before my mind did. "Mom," he said when I answered, "are you home?" "Yes," I replied quickly. "Is everything okay?" There was a pause, longer than usual. "Claire and I have been talking," he said carefully. Something in my chest tightened instantly. "And," I asked. "We think it might be okay for you to see Ethan again," he said. For a moment, I couldn't respond. I had to sit down. My hand gripped the edge of the table. "Really?" I asked quietly, almost afraid that if I spoke too loudly, the moment would break. "Yes," he said, "but only for a short visit." Short. That word no longer surprised me. I nodded even though he couldn't see me. "Of course," I said quickly. "Anything, I just want to see him." "Good," Daniel replied, though his voice still sounded uncertain. "Tomorrow afternoon, I'll bring him over for a bit." After the call ended, I just sat there. I didn't smile right away. Not because I wasn't happy, but because something inside me had learned to hesitate before joy now. I had started to understand that happiness in my situation rarely came without conditions attached. The next day felt endless. I cleaned the house twice. I prepared snacks, even though I didn't know if he would stay long enough to eat them. I kept checking the clock every few minutes, each passing hour stretching my nerves tighter. And then, finally, the knock came. My heart jumped. I opened the door so quickly, I almost forgot to breathe. Daniel stood there. And beside him, Ethan. For a second, I couldn't move. He looked different again. Just slightly older. Just slightly more distant. But when his eyes met mine, everything else disappeared. "Grandma," he said instantly, breaking free from Daniel's hand and running toward me. I dropped to my knees and caught him before he could reach the floor. The moment I held him, something inside me cracked open completely. He was real. Warm. Breathing. Here. "I missed you so much," I whispered, holding him tightly. "I miss you too," he said, burying his face into my shoulder like he used to. I closed my eyes, trying to hold on to that moment as if it could last longer if I refused to let go. Behind him, Daniel stood quietly. And behind Daniel, Claire wasn't there. I noticed it immediately, though I didn't ask. For a while, everything felt almost normal again. Ethan played in the living room, laughing as I showed him small tricks with his toys, telling him stories in soft voices he remembered. He would run back to me every few minutes, as if making sure I was still there, still real. Every time he did, something inside me softened. And every time he left my arms, something else tightened. Because I knew how temporary this was. I could feel it in the way Daniel kept checking his phone, in the way he watched the clock, in the way he avoided my eyes when Ethan laughed too loudly or stayed too long in my lap. Time was not on my side. Eventually, Ethan grew tired. He climbed onto the couch beside me and rested his head on my leg. "Don't go," he mumbled sleepily. My throat tightened instantly. "I don't want to go," I whispered. Daniel cleared his throat gently. "Mom, I think we should start heading back soon." The words hit harder than I expected. I nodded slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. "Of course." I looked down at Ethan, brushing his hair back softly. "Grandma will see you again soon," I said. "Promise?" he asked, his small eyes barely open. That question. Simple. Dangerous. I hesitated for only a second. Then I smiled softly. "Promise." Even though I didn't fully believe it anymore. Daniel helped Ethan up slowly. As I walked them to the door, I tried to memorize everything. His voice, his smell, the way his hand still reached for mine even as he was being taken away again. At the doorway, Ethan turned back one last time. "Bye, Grandma." "Bye, my love," I said, my voice breaking slightly. And then he was gone. The house fell silent again, almost instantly. But this silence was different from before, because now I had felt him again. And losing something twice hurts more than losing it once. I stood by the door long after they left, staring at the empty space where he had just been. My chest felt tight, like something had been pulled out and left unfinished inside me. I knew then that this cycle was becoming dangerous. A brief return, a short happiness, followed by another disappearance. It wasn't healing me. It was breaking me in smaller, deeper ways. And what scared me most wasn't the distance anymore. It was the feeling that someone was deciding how long I was allowed to be part of his life. And I had no control over when it would be taken away again. After that visit, I stopped trying to measure time in days. It didn't matter anymore whether it was a week or a month between seeing Ethan. What mattered was the pattern that was forming, brief returns followed by sudden absences, like waves pulling something precious in and out of reach before I could hold on to it properly. And each time he left, a part of me stayed behind with him. The house became quieter again, but now it felt different than before. It wasn't the same old loneliness I had learned to live with after my husband passed. This was sharper, more restless, because now I knew what I was missing. I could remember his laughter, his voice, the way he said, "Grandma," like it was the most natural thing in the world for me to be there. And that memory made the silence unbearable. I tried to distract myself. I really did. I would clean rooms that were already clean. I would cook food I had no appetite for. I would sit in front of the television without absorbing anything. But no matter what I did, my mind kept returning to Ethan, and to the feeling that I was slowly being placed on the outside of his life. A few days later, Daniel called again. This time, his voice sounded different, more formal, less warm. "Mom," he said, "can we meet today?" Something in my stomach tightened immediately. "Yes," I said. "Is something wrong?" "No," he replied quickly. "It's just we need to talk. We need to talk." Those words never meant anything simple. When he arrived, he didn't bring Ethan. That alone told me enough. He sat down without much hesitation this time, as if he had already rehearsed what he was going to say. "I want to be honest with you," he began. I nodded slowly, bracing myself. "Claire and I have been trying to figure out what's best for Ethan long-term," he said. I stayed quiet. "And we think the current arrangement is still not working." My heart sank slightly, but I kept my expression steady. "What arrangement?" "The visits," he clarified, "the back and forth." I looked at him carefully. He was happy last time. "I know," he said quickly, "but afterward he struggles." "Struggles how?" I asked. Daniel hesitated. That hesitation again. "He gets emotional when you leave," he finally said. "It takes him time to settle." I felt something sharp rise in my chest, but I controlled it. "He's a child," I said softly. "Of course he gets emotional. That doesn't mean something is wrong." "It does if it keeps happening," he replied. Silence filled the room for a moment. I studied my son carefully. There was something different in him now, not unkindness, but distance. Like he was repeating something he had been told, not something he fully believed. "Daniel," I said gently, "what do you actually think?" He looked away. And that was the answer again. Finally, he spoke. "I think we need to reduce contact for a while." Reduce. Not pause. Not stop. Reduce. As if I was something that needed to be minimized. I swallowed hard. For how long? "I don't know," he admitted again. That uncertainty hurt more than anything else. I nodded slowly, though my hands were trembling slightly in my lap. "All right," I said quietly, "if that's what you think is best." Relief crossed his face, but it was mixed with guilt. Because even he knew this wasn't simple. Before leaving, he paused at the door. "Mom," he said softly, "this isn't forever." I gave a small nod. But in my heart, I wasn't sure anymore what forever meant in my life. After he left, I sat alone for a long time. The house felt heavier than usual. Not empty, just emotionally crowded with everything I wasn't allowed to hold on to. That night, I took out Ethan's drawing again. The same one he had sent before. The stick figures. The words "miss you." I traced them slowly with my fingers. And for the first time, a different feeling began to rise inside me. Not just sadness, not just longing, but confusion. Because none of this matched what I had experienced with him. He didn't forget me. He didn't reject me. Every time I saw him, he ran to me like I was his safest place. So why was I being told that my presence was harmful? Why was love something that needed to be reduced? Days passed again. No visits. No calls from Ethan. And something began to shift inside me. At first, I told myself to be patient, to trust Daniel, to respect Claire's concerns. But slowly, a thought began to form that I couldn't push away anymore. What if this wasn't just about Ethan's behavior? What if it was about control over access itself? Because every time I was close to him, something changed. Every time I bonded with him again, the distance increased afterward. It felt intentional in a way I didn't want to believe. One evening, I finally decided to call Daniel myself. He answered after a few rings. "Mom, I need to ask you something," I said quietly. There was a pause. "Okay. Is Claire the one making these decisions, or are you?" Silence. A long one. And in that silence, I already understood more than I wanted to. "I'm involved," he said carefully. "That's not what I asked," I replied gently. Another pause. Then finally, "Yes." Just that. One word. But it changed everything. Because now I knew this wasn't just distance. It wasn't just concern. It was a decision being made. And I was no longer part of it. After Daniel said that one word, I didn't respond right away. Yes. It should have been simple, clean, but it was. It hung in the air between us like something unfinished, something that couldn't be taken back once spoken. I could hear faint sounds on his end, movement, maybe a television, maybe Claire nearby, but I barely registered them. My mind had gone still in a way that felt almost unreal. "So it's decided then," I said finally, my voice softer than I intended. "Mom, it's not like that," Daniel quickly replied. But even he didn't sound fully convinced. I nodded even though he couldn't see me. "All right." Another silence followed. This time, it wasn't uncomfortable for him. It was heavy for me. "I'll talk to you later," he said eventually. "Okay," I answered. And the call ended. I sat there for a long time afterward, the phone still in my hand, as if I expected it to ring again and change everything back. But it didn't. Nothing changed back. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I kept thinking about Ethan, about his voice, about the way he said "grandma" like it was something constant, something reliable. Children don't understand decisions made in silence. They only understand presence and absence, and I was slowly becoming absence. Days passed again in a blur. No visits were scheduled. No calls from Ethan. Only occasional, short messages from Daniel, practical, distant, polite. Ethan is doing fine. He's busy with routines. We're adjusting things. Adjusting. Always adjusting. Never explaining. One afternoon, I decided to drive past their house. I told myself I wouldn't go in. I told myself I was only going to see the place. To reassure myself that they were okay, that Ethan was okay. But when I reached the street, my hands tightened on the steering wheel. The house looked the same. Quiet. Ordinary. But everything inside me felt different. I parked a little farther away and sat there for a while, just watching. I told myself I wouldn't get out. I didn't. But I saw movement through the window. Small movement. A child. Ethan. My breath caught instantly. He was in the living room, moving around, playing with something on the floor. I couldn't see clearly, but I recognized his shape immediately. That small, familiar energy. For a moment, everything inside me wanted to run to the door. To knock. To call his name. To hold him again. But I didn't. Because something else stopped me. Claire. She appeared in the background a moment later, moving through the room with a calm, controlled pace. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't tense. Just present, watching him occasionally, then looking away. And in that moment, something clicked inside me. This wasn't chaos. This was structure. A structure I was no longer part of. I sat there for a long time before finally driving away. And as I left, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger. Not desperation. But displacement. Like I had been gently removed from a place I still emotionally occupied. That night, Daniel called again. I almost didn't answer. But I did. "Mom," he said immediately, "I wanted to check in." "I saw him today," I said without thinking. A pause. "You went to the house," his voice sharpened slightly. "I didn't go inside," I clarified quickly. "I just passed by." "Mom, you can't do that," he said, more firm now. I closed my eyes. I just needed to see him. "He's fine," Daniel replied. "But you can't show up like that. It confuses things." There it was again. Confusion. Always the same explanation. "I'm not trying to confuse anything," I said quietly. "I'm his grandmother." "I know," he said, softer now, "but things are delicate right now." Delicate. As if I was something fragile enough to break everything just by being near. I didn't argue. I didn't have the energy for it anymore. Instead, I asked something I had been holding back for days. "Daniel, does Ethan ask about me?" There was a pause. A long one. Then carefully, "Sometimes." That word gave me a strange mix of pain and relief. "Does he miss me?" I asked. Another pause. "Yes," he admitted quietly. My throat tightened. "But," he continued, "he adjusts quickly." Adjusts. Children always adjust quickly when they are guided in a new direction. After the call ended, I sat in silence again. But this time, something inside me was different. The sadness was still there. The longing was still there. But underneath it was something forming. A question I could no longer ignore. If Ethan missed me. If he still reached for me. If he still remembered me. Then why was I being told that distance was necessary for his well-being? Why did love need to be controlled instead of allowed? That night, I opened the drawer where I kept everything related to him. The drawing. A small toy he had left behind once. A photo. And I realized something I hadn't admitted to myself before. I wasn't just being kept away. I was being replaced in the structure of his daily life. Slowly. Quietly. Systematically. And what frightened me most wasn't losing access to him. It was realizing that he might grow up being taught that my absence was normal. After that realization, I stopped sleeping properly. Not because I was panicking in the loud, obvious way, but because my mind refused to settle. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan's face. Every time I opened them, I saw the empty house around me and felt the gap between what was and what had become. Days no longer felt like time passing. They felt like something being taken. Silently. Carefully. One afternoon, I received a message from Daniel. "Can you come over for a short visit tomorrow?" Claire agreed. I read it 3 times before replying. "Of course," I wrote. But my hands were shaking slightly. Even now, even after everything, That small message had the power to change my entire emotional state. Hope returned immediately. And with it, fear. Because hope had stopped being safe. The next day, I arrived earlier than planned. I told myself it was just timing, but really I wanted a moment to prepare myself, to steady my heart before seeing him again. When I pulled up outside the house, everything looked normal. Too normal. As if nothing inside it had ever changed. Daniel opened the door before I could knock properly. "Hey," he said softly, "come in." His tone was careful, controlled. Claire was not immediately visible. That alone surprised me. "Where is Ethan?" I asked quickly. "In his room," Daniel replied. "He'll come out in a minute." I nodded, trying to keep myself calm. I stepped inside slowly. The house smelled the same. Familiar. But emotionally, it didn't feel like mine anymore, not even for a moment. I sat in the living room, my hands folded tightly in my lap. Every second felt stretched. Waiting. Listening. Then I heard footsteps. Small ones. Running. My heart reacted before I even saw him. "Grandma." Ethan appeared in the hallway and ran straight toward me. That sound. That voice. It broke something inside me instantly. I stood up quickly and caught him as he jumped into my arms. For a few seconds, nothing else existed. He clung to me tightly, his small arms wrapping around my neck with a strength that only children have when they are afraid of losing something they love. "I missed you," he said immediately. "I missed you more," I whispered back, holding him close. I closed my eyes, trying to memorize everything again. His weight. His warmth. The feeling of him breathing against me. Because I didn't know how long I would be allowed to feel it this time. When I finally opened my eyes, Claire was standing at the edge of the room. Watching. Not smiling. Not angry. Just observing. Like someone measuring something silently. Daniel stood slightly behind her. Uncertain. The visit started off normally. Or as normally as it could. Ethan played near me, showing me toys, asking me to build things with him, laughing when I made small mistakes on purpose just to hear him laugh again. Every sound he made felt like something I had been deprived of for too long. But I noticed something new. He didn't stay with me the way he used to. He would come, stay for a while, then glance toward Claire or Daniel before moving back to them. As if checking something. As if learning a pattern. That unsettled me more than I expected. At one point, he sat between Claire and me on the floor. And when he leaned slightly toward me, Claire gently redirected him. "Come here, sweetheart," she said softly. "Sit closer to Mommy." It wasn't harsh. It wasn't obvious. But it was consistent. Small adjustments. Subtle steering. Ethan complied without protest. And that small compliance hurt more than anything else. Because children adapt to the world they are shown. The visit was shorter than before. I could feel it ending before anyone said it out loud. Eventually, Daniel stood up. "Mom," he said quietly, "we should probably head out soon." I nodded slowly. Ethan immediately turned toward me. "No," he said, "stay." My heart tightened. I knelt down in front of him. "I have to go, sweetheart." His face changed instantly. Confusion. Disappointment. That familiar sadness I had started to dread. "Why?" he asked. I looked at him, trying to find words that wouldn't hurt him. "Because Grandma has to," I said softly. He stepped forward and hugged me again. Tighter this time. "Don't go," he whispered. My throat closed. For a moment, I couldn't move. Behind him, Claire was watching quietly. And I realized something in that moment. This goodbye was being witnessed differently now. Not just emotionally, but structurally, as if it was part of a process. I held Ethan for a few seconds longer, then slowly pulled back. "I'll see you again," I said. He didn't respond immediately. He just nodded slightly, unsure. As I stood up, Daniel walked me toward the door. Claire stayed behind. When we reached the entrance, Daniel spoke quietly. "I'm sorry," he said. I looked at him. For what? He hesitated. For everything being complicated. I gave a small, tired smile. "It's not your fault that I love him." He didn't answer that. Because he knew it wasn't that simple. As I stepped outside, Ethan called my name one more time from inside the house. "Grandma." I turned back immediately. He was standing in the doorway, waving, smiling. And for a second, everything felt normal again. Then the door began to close. Slowly. Not abruptly. Not harshly. Just gently. Like something being put away. And that was when I understood something I couldn't ignore anymore. This wasn't just distance. This was a transition. And I was being moved out of his world, one carefully controlled visit at a time. After that visit, I stopped waiting for the phone to ring. Not because I had stopped hopping, but because hope had started to feel like something that kept reopening the same wound. Each time I thought I might hear Ethan's voice again, the silence that followed felt heavier than before. The house returned to its old rhythm. Quiet mornings. Long afternoons. Nights that stretched too far. But I was no longer the same woman who had learned to live in that silence after losing my husband. This silence was different. It was filled with memory, with interruption, with something I could no longer unfeel. Ethan's last hug stayed with me longer than anything else. The way he held on. The way he hesitated when I told him I had to go. That moment kept replaying in my mind, not as a memory I could cherish peacefully, but as something unresolved. As if he had been left mid-sentence. A few days later, Daniel called again. His voice sounded more strained than usual. "Mom," he said, "can we meet? Just you and me." I already knew what that meant. "Yes," I said quietly. We met at a small cafe, not far from my home. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting with his hands folded tightly together on the table. He looked tired, not just physically, but in a way that suggested constant internal pressure. I sat down across from him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he finally exhaled. "I think we need to make things more structured," he said. Structured. That word again. I nodded slowly. "What does that mean this time?" He hesitated. "Claire thinks, and I agree, that inconsistent visits are affecting Ethan." I listened without interrupting. "She says he gets emotionally unsettled afterward," he continued. "So we should create a fixed schedule." A fixed schedule. Something inside me tightened. "As in controlled timing?" I asked gently. "Regular timing," he corrected, though it didn't sound much different. "And if I don't fit into that schedule?" I asked. He looked down. That was answer enough. I leaned back slightly in my chair. "So I don't just see him when I'm wanted," I said softly. "I see him when I'm allowed." Daniel's jaw tightened. "It's not like that." But it was. And we both knew it. "I'm not trying to make this difficult," I continued quietly. "I just want to understand where I stand." He rubbed his forehead, clearly struggling. "Mom, you're still his grandmother. Nothing changes that." But words and reality were no longer matching. "Then why does it feel like I'm being managed instead of included?" I asked. He didn't respond immediately. And in that silence, I saw something I hadn't wanted to admit before. Daniel was not fully in control of this anymore. Claire was influencing decisions, but more than that, a system had formed. One where rules were being built around Ethan's routine, and I was becoming an external variable that had to be adjusted rather than embraced. Finally, Daniel spoke again. "We're just trying to do what's best for him." That sentence. It always came back to that sentence. I looked at him carefully. And what about what's best for him emotionally long-term? I asked softly. Does he not deserve to have his grandmother in his life consistently? Daniel didn't answer right away. Because that question didn't have a simple answer anymore. We sat in silence for a while after that. The kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels final in small ways. Before leaving, I asked him something I had been avoiding for a long time. Does Ethan still ask for me? Daniel hesitated, then nodded slightly. Yes. My chest tightened. But less often now, he added quietly. That second sentence mattered more than the first. Less often. Because children don't forget all at once. They forget gradually. Through absence. Through adjustment. Through repetition of who is present and who is not. After I got home that evening, I didn't turn on the lights immediately. I just sat in the dark for a while. Thinking. Not just about Ethan, but about what was happening to him without me there. Because I realized something I hadn't fully accepted before. This wasn't just about me being removed from his life. It was about him adapting to a version of life where I was no longer central. And that thought frightened me more than anything else. Because children don't question what they are given. They normalize it. And if I was slowly being reduced to a memory instead of a presence, then one day Ethan might stop asking at all. Not because he stopped loving me, but because he stopped expecting me to be there. That night, I opened my drawer again. The drawing, the small toy, the photograph, and I realized something painful but clear. I wasn't fighting for visits anymore. I was fighting to remain real in his life. After that realization, something inside me stopped reacting the same way. Not completely, not suddenly, but enough that I noticed it. The constant waiting for calls became less frantic. The checking of my phone every few minutes slowly reduced. The house remained quiet, but I stopped expecting it to break that silence with Ethan's voice. It wasn't acceptance. It was exhaustion. And exhaustion has a way of making even hope sit quietly in the background. Days passed without any visit. Then weeks. No clear schedule arrived. No fixed routine was ever fully established. Everything remained uncertain, floating somewhere between permission and restriction. And in that uncertainty, Ethan's presence in my life began to feel like something I had to remember rather than experience. One afternoon, Daniel finally called again. His voice was softer this time, almost hesitant. "Mom," he said, "we've been trying to follow the structure more consistently." I understood what that meant without him needing to explain further. "And," I asked gently, "there's going to be a longer gap now," he continued. "Claire thinks Ethan needs time to adjust without too many emotional disruptions." I closed my eyes for a moment. Longer gap. Another step back. "How long?" I asked. "I'm not sure," he admitted. That answer had become too familiar. I stayed quiet for a moment, then spoke carefully. "Daniel, do you ever think about how Ethan feels in all of this?" He hesitated. "I do," he said. "But," I added softly. Another pause. "But I also think we can't ignore what we're being told by professionals," he said. Professionals. That word added a new layer to everything. It meant advice had now turned into authority. Guidance had turned into direction. And my place in Ethan's life was now being measured not by love, but by interpretation. "I understand," I said quietly. But I didn't. Not fully. After the call ended, I sat for a long time without moving. There was no anger anymore. Not the sharp kind. It had softened into something quieter. Something that sat in the chest instead of rising outward. A few days later, something unexpected happened. I received another message. Not from Daniel. From Claire. I stared at her name on the screen for a long time before opening it. The message was short. We think it might be okay for a short visit this weekend. Please keep it calm and brief for Ethan's routine. I read it twice, then a third time. There was no warmth in it. No invitation. Just permission. Controlled, conditional, measured. But still, it was Ethan. So I agreed. That weekend, I arrived at their house once again. The air felt the same, but my body reacted differently now. There was less anticipation, more caution, as if I had learned not to expect continuity. When I stepped inside, Ethan was already there. He saw me instantly. And for a brief second, his face lit up exactly the same way it always had. "Grandma." He ran toward me without hesitation. I knelt down and caught him, holding him tightly. For a moment, everything returned. The laughter, the warmth, the feeling that I still belonged somewhere in his world. But it didn't last as long as before. I noticed it immediately. He pulled back slightly sooner, looked toward Claire sooner, checked the room sooner, as if his attention was being gently guided elsewhere. Not forced, just redirected. The visit passed in fragments. Moments of closeness, followed by subtle separations. Small reminders that I was no longer the center of his comfort. Eventually, Claire spoke softly. "Ethan, time to get ready for your nap." He hesitated, looked at me, then at her, then slowly stood up. I smiled gently, even though something inside me tightened. "Go ahead," I said softly. "I'll see you again soon." He nodded. And then, just like that, he was led away. No tears this time. No resistance. Just compliance. And that scared me more than anything else. Because I realized what was happening. He was adapting. Not forgetting. Adapting. After I left that day, I didn't cry immediately. I drove home in silence. And for the first time, I understood something deeply uncomfortable. This wasn't just about reducing visits. This was about reshaping attachment. Slowly, carefully, until my presence was no longer something he reached for first, but something he had learned to live without reaching for at all. And I could feel it happening. Even if no one said it out loud, the last visit did not feel like a beginning anymore. It felt like a pause inside something already ending. When I arrived, Ethan was sitting on the floor again, quietly stacking blocks. He looked up when I entered, and for a moment, just a moment, his face lit up in that familiar way. "Grandma," he said softly. I smiled and knelt down. "Hi, my love." He came to me, but not with the same urgency as before. There was still affection, still recognition, but it was gentler now, slower, as if he was learning to divide his attention between what he felt and what he had been shown. I held him, and I could feel it immediately. He had grown again. Not just in size, but in presence. Children change quickly when life around them is structured tightly. They adapt to rhythm, to rules, to repetition, and Ethan was no different. We played quietly for a while. He showed me his toys, asked simple questions, laughed softly when I responded. Everything was calm, controlled, almost rehearsed in its normality. But I kept noticing small things. The way he looked toward Claire more often than before. The way he paused before coming too close to me. The way he didn't hold on for as long when I hugged him. None of it was dramatic. That was the hardest part. Nothing was dramatic enough to point at and say this is wrong. It was all just gradual, like water wearing down stone. Eventually, Claire announced softly, "Ethan, time to clean up." He obeyed immediately. No hesitation. No protest. Just instinctive compliance. I watched him carefully as he gathered his toys. And something inside me tightened, not because he was listening, but because he no longer questioned it. That is what structure does. It replaces uncertainty with behavior. Daniel stood near the doorway, silent as usual during these moments. Claire moved efficiently, already guiding Ethan toward the next step of his routine. And I realized then that I was no longer part of that structure. Not even temporarily. I was an interruption inside it. When Ethan came back for a final hug, it felt different. Still warm. Still real. But shorter. "Bye, Grandma," he said. "Bye, my sweet boy," I whispered, holding him close for as long as I was allowed without it becoming noticeable. Then he pulled away easily and walked toward his mother, without looking back. That detail stayed with me longer than anything else. Not because he didn't love me, but because he didn't hesitate. As I stepped outside, Daniel followed me to the door. "Mom," he started. I turned. He looked tired. Conflicted. "I don't know what else to say," he admitted. I gave a small nod. "You don't have to say anything." He frowned slightly. "This isn't easy for me either." "I know," I said gently. And I did know. But knowing doesn't always change what is happening. Before I left, I looked back once. Ethan was visible through the window, sitting again, already engaged in something else, already continuing his day as if the moment with me was just one small part of it. A contained moment. Not a lasting one. I didn't wave. Neither did he. And that silence between us felt final in a way I couldn't explain. When I reached home that night, I didn't sit in the living room. I went straight to my bedroom and placed Ethan's drawing on the table beside me. The same drawing I had kept from the beginning. The stick figures. The "miss you." I sat there for a long time, looking at it. And I finally understood something I had been resisting for too long. This was not sudden. It was not accidental. It was not even cruel in a direct way. It was gradual replacement. Of presence with routine. Of memory with structure. Of emotional attachment with controlled familiarity. And I was watching it happen in real time. Not through anger. Not through confrontation. But through silence. That night, I made a decision I didn't speak out loud. Not out of anger. Not out of defeat. But out of clarity. I would stop chasing moments that were shrinking. Because love should not require permission to exist. And if I was being reduced to something Ethan only remembered in passing, then I had to accept the painful truth. I was not losing him all at once. I was losing him slowly enough to watch it happen. And that was the hardest kind of goodbye there is.